Hello and welcome to this brief webinar addressing the topic of structuring your child's academic day during COVID-19. My name is Louise Southern and I'm the Associate Clinical Director, and I'm here to talk about some brief tips and strategies that might be useful to you during these challenging times where you're having to support your child's educational experience through online or e-learning. So in this brief webinar, I'm going to touch on 4 key areas and try to provide some practical strategies and guidelines, which fall under the following 4 areas of prioritizing or focusing on what matters most. Secondly, breaking the hard stuff up. Third, restructuring to make things manageable and meaningful for the student with autism. And then finally, celebrating the little successes. So this has not been an easy time. As as has been said throughout social media in the recent weeks, we are all in this pandemic together. But we are not all in the same boat. For some, this may provide the time needed to reconnect and slow down as a family. For others, though, this is a desperate crisis on every level, producing major economic hardship, in some cases physical health crises, or worse. And as it pertains to academics and autism, this is likely true as well. For some students with autism, maybe this is a welcome break from the books. For some, this may be a time to shine even more without the sometimes overwhelming pressure of classroom settings, keeping up with the pace of the classroom instruction in real time, here in social demands, etc. But for others, this is a very challenging time where students with autism are without the structure and predictability of their traditional school day. And they're encountering instruction in academics and assignments that may look very different from what they are accustomed to. Parents and caregivers now face the new and tremendous challenge of facilitating and overseeing the majority of their child's academic day, on top of every other demand that they were already experiencing. And as you can see, this image here is but one representation of the experience that some parents and students are having. This looks very different for each person and for each family. And whatever it looks like for you, we know that this can be a very challenging time. I reached out to a number of parents of children and adolescents with autism during this period just to get their perspective on how they're experiencing this. One family wrote back and said, you nearly need a class to homeschool your child, multiple platforms for learning. The tasks are not intuitive. It's a full-time job just to keep up with his work. Another parent wrote that everything feels like a battle, making sure they read the instructions before they got started, making sure they edited their work, making sure they actually submitted the work and turned it in. I'm getting resistance at every point. And so, these were just 2 quotes of many reflecting some of the experiences that we know that parents of students with autism are having right now. And before I even start, I want you to know that you're doing the best that you can. And the aim here is to try to make a few adjustments or refinements that might make things easier for you and for your child with autism. As I talk through these brief strategies, I encourage you just to take away one area that you want to focus on, one minor adjustment or refinement. Don't try to do everything at once. None of us can do that, even in the best of circumstances. So instead, focus on what matters most. You are going to define this for yourself. I can't define what matters most for you. Of course, you're going to do this. Whatever this is for you and your family and for your child with autism, though, I encourage you through this challenging time where you may be bombarded with a lot of emails from educators, a lot of academic assignments for your child. Focus on what matters most. And this is probably obvious, but it's just important to remember that in these trying times, and always really, that there are things that are more important than academic functioning. There are things that are more important than getting that list of tasks done. Working to maintain or to strengthen relationships and finding those opportunities for quality, positive time together, whether that's 5 minutes or 2 hours, that's what's most important. Supporting your child so that they remain relatively calm and relatively happy and safe from a behavioral and mental health and physical perspective matters most, of course. And of course, your own health matters too. We talk about this in almost every webinar or blog that we're putting out right now, but self-care is so important. Just trying to find those few moments for yourself each day, whether that's, again, 5 minutes or an hour, to just focus on your own needs. This is really important. I really like this quote from Susan Stifelman. She's a marriage and family therapist. Um, when our children perceive us as steady and calm, regardless of their moods or behavior, they can relax, knowing they can rely on us to get them through the challenging moments of their lives. In essence, be the calm in the storm. And I'm saying this to myself as much as I'm saying it to you. In these uncertain times, when I'm coming unglued, and my children can see that, then my children are, of course, more likely to become unglued as well. So as you're receiving all of these academic assignments for your child and you're trying to navigate from an administrative perspective, maybe the many different virtual platforms and communications that you need to have or that your child needs to have with their teachers, in essence, do what works best for you and for your child. This was a quote from one family that I spoke to recently. It seems too overwhelming. So finally, we decided to do English language arts on Mondays, math on Tuesdays, civics on Wednesday, and biology on Thursdays. And on Friday, he completes anything he hasn't already done. So this parent changed what was traditionally scheduled for her child and restructured it in a way that was more effective and successful for him. This is the perspective of another parent that I recently communicated with. Do what works for you. And she expressed that, his teacher is really trying to do everything that she can, but the online learning piece is just not meaningful for this particular individual with autism. He cannot learn that way. So instead, she's just focusing on his social and communication skills, working to promote more independence in his daily activities at home, and getting out as much energy as she possibly can. She's doing what works for him and what works for her family. And so to that end, I would say, just try to make it fun and functional wherever you can. Doing what works for you and for your child with autism means that while schoolwork may be important, of course, consider the ways that you can address those most important objectives away from the desk, away from the table, and away from the screen in the areas of your child's development that matter most, whether that's in the area of self-advocacy. And self-advocacy comes in a whole lot of different forms, from basic requesting of wants and needs in whatever way that comes, all the way up through more advanced forms of self-advocacy, where you're supporting your child with autism in communicating through email to his teacher to express where he needs assistance or clarification. It comes in the area of social communication skills, of course, for our children with autism and adolescents with autism, whether it's in the area of activities of daily living, completing basic chores and tasks and routines, grooming and hygiene and self-care activities. Of course, functional academics in the area of functional math or functional reading and language arts. Play and leisure activities are critical areas of development for our children and adolescents with autism. Obviously, health and wellness and community navigation, whether that be outside in the real community or safely and effectively and appropriately navigating the social world and online world right now. So teaching and addressing those areas in whatever way makes sense for your child. Maybe it comes in the form of playing hide and seek to practice early academic skills like rote counting, or language skills like labeling rooms of the house, or prepositional phrases like, I found you under the bed, and perspective taking. So teaching your child that you understood where he or she was hiding because you saw the chair move. A lot of learning can be embedded into a simple routine like hide and seek. Or if you want your child to recognize sight words, maybe you're writing each word on a large piece of paper and then scattering them all around the ground, and you're having your child jump to the words that you name to support them in recognizing those sight words. Playing a card game or board game, of course, addresses so many important skills that are functional for your child. Skills like waiting and turn taking, conversational skills in whatever level your child is at. Basic academics can be addressed through board games and card games, of course, like counting with one-to-one correspondence and matching and sorting. Any board game that requires following a certain number of instructions or steps is, of course, important. Maybe the activities come in the form of cooking together at whatever level of complexity that is. Maybe it's reading and writing down ingredient lists together, following directions, targeting skills like measurement and monitoring time as you set the cooking duration, all embedding math into those basic activities. Taking walks outside, playing I Spy as you walk, or scavenger hunts, or addressing certain science themes as you go on a walk outdoors. And of course, give yourself permission to not have a quote unquote lesson plan in mind too. It's okay to just play or to go on a walk or to try to engage your child without needing to check off any boxes at all. Having those moments of happy engagement together in whatever way that looks for you is an A+ grade for you both. So again, as I touch on these key areas where I'm going to go next, I've briefly emphasized the idea that just focus on what matters most and put first things first. And next, I'm going to talk about breaking the hard stuff up and making it meaningful and manageable by restructuring some of the activities and restructuring the way we present the information to our children and adolescents with autism as they encounter online learning activities. And so to go into this a little bit further, we want to define and to clarify and to restructure activities in a way that can promote success, that can promote relative independence for the student with autism, that can promote a great just overall happiness or a greater degree of happiness as they try to complete these activities. So this kind of comes into four main areas. Of course, having a plan in mind, a to-do list that's presented in visual form, clarifying and defining roles and expectations, and then of course, restructuring as needed activities and assignments to make them more manageable and meaningful for the student with autism. So creating this plan and clarifying in concrete, clear terms for your child with autism, what's going to happen and in what order, these can come in a wide variety of forms. These are examples of more complex to-do lists or schedules that break down for the child what's going to happen. You can see here on the left, this is a pretty complex, sophisticated format that a parent has developed. Maybe it doesn't need to be this complicated or prescribed. And on the right, you can see another example. This was one I actually developed for my own child, my fourth grade child who does not have autism, but of course he still needs a visual support to help promote independence and to help him work through the activities that need to be done. And for him, he was able to select the order in which he completed most of these activities. But just supporting independence, clarifying expectations, and clarifying, for example, when video games or screen time can be accessed. These come in a wide variety of forms, of course, for individuals with autism. Here's another way that the academic activities might be broken down and represented. And so this is an example where we can see sticky cards where the parent has presented and broken down math and broken down the reading activities and clarified when breaks are going to happen. And as the child completes each segment, he or she pulls this sticky note off and tosses it in the trash. It's a concrete, visual, tangible representation of what's expected and in what order. And so for all of these examples, I'm going to show you what we often are finding as we're supporting students with autism in this online learning phase that we find ourselves in is that parents and caregivers are having to, of course, receive and filter the information that they're receiving from teachers. And then once they've filtered and received that information, then the parent or caregiver has to go to the next step of breaking that information down in a way that's manageable and meaningful for the individual with autism, breaking down what the plan is going to be, the plan of attack, essentially. What's going to be our to-do list? How are we going to get this done? Here's another representation of addressing academic tasks in this context. So you've got 5 math problems, and then you're going to get your tablet. And of course, in the same vein of defining the plan and clarifying what's going to happen in what order, it's important, to the best that we can within our homes and spaces is to define where work should be done and define the expectations for work versus play. And I developed this slide in part because I was in touch with a number of parents whose students are, of course, engaged in online learning. And so it's with one click of a button, they could drift right over into a different website that's not related to academics. And so it can be very hard for many of our students with autism to kind of control those impulses and to stay focused on the task at hand rather than drifting over into more preferred videos and online games or whatever that individual is interested in. And so clearly defining spaces and expectations for work versus play. This is but one example you can see here. It's a basic written list, and it says first he needs to go to the Read Work site. All other windows should be closed. There are 10 questions related to the Read Works assignment for today, and then he gets free online time. And so this parent concretely broke these expectations down into written form for her child with autism, and just defining those rules visually. It reduces some of the need for continued verbal engagement in the midst of kind of argument or negotiation. It's the visual that this parent can point back to and reference to remind her child of his or her child of the expectations. This is but one example of how this information and these rules might need to be presented. For another individual with autism, they might be presented in a first-then format. First work, then computer time. So thinking about what does your child need, how can we concretely visually break down the rules and expectations that will support them in getting the work that we've decided that is manageable for that day, and getting that work done. Here's another example of concretely defining rules and expectations. And so this was in part something that I developed when I was talking to the parent of a student with autism who really struggles to accept edits and feedback from the teacher, but even more so struggles to do so from his or own parents. And so this was the basic editing checklist that the parent developed. So of course, he needs to write his work in pencil or type it online. And then the first step in his editing process after he's written needs to be read it like I wrote it. Are there any words missing? The next step is that he's checking for spelling line by line. Then the student is checking for punctuation and making adjustments as needed. Then the student is checking for capitalization. So ideally, this editing checklist is a visual support, guides the student with autism in more independently engaging in an editing process so that other folks aren't having to do that editing for him. But in this case, what needs kind of the layer that had to happen on top of this was that then dad also needs to be able to check his work. So for this particular student with autism, we were working to help him accept the fact that dad or parent needs to be able to check his work as well. And so then dad engages in the checklist. He reads it like he wrote it. Were there any words missing? Then dad checks for spelling in a supportive and positive manner. Then dad checks for punctuation. Then dad checks for capitalization. And then there's this sort of social narrative or social story built into this visual support for this student with autism. If dad finds an edit to make, it will be okay. I will fix it. Then I can turn my work in online. And then after I make my edits, I get a video game break. So this information is not just verbally conveyed to this student with autism, but rather this is the visual edits agreement that the parent and student have come up with together. And this kind of defines the rules, the expectations, and it clarifies for this student with autism the light at the end of the tunnel. Even though I don't like to do edits with my dad, when it's done, I can turn my work in and then I get to access video game break. Concretely visually defining is the key here. There are other ways to concretely and visually define as well. So I have an example here of one of many social narratives that we've developed at the Autism Society that are aimed at supporting parents and caregivers and professionals in supporting folks with autism during these challenging times. This is just one example. So this is kind of a social narrative that gets at that same, to some extent, the same issue as I was talking about on the previous slide. My parents are having to help me with my schoolwork right now. And so the reason we wrote this is because we were hearing from a number of parents who were telling us that it's hard for their child with autism to accept that at this point, the parent is to some extent acting as the teacher, at least in the live direct way, because the parent's having to facilitate much of that academic day and kind of guide them through the day, of course, and support them in getting those tasks and activities done. And this can be very hard for some students with autism, of course, to accept and to understand. And so this is but one social narrative that's intended to help explain this situation to the student with autism. Here's another example. This one comes from the O'Callaghan Gallery of Intervention site. And this is just I screenshot this part of the social story. This social story is intended to convey or explain how to manage your frustration when the internet isn't working. And this can be really stressful, of course, for some folks with autism, and of course for many of us, when the internet's not working or our computer's not working as we expect, and we feel like we have to turn our work in at a certain deadline. This can be really stressful. So this social narrative was intended help explain that to the student with autism and to help give them some strategies that they can use to deal with this situation. Those were just two examples of social narratives that relate to this topic of structuring your child's academic day during COVID. And there are a lot of other great websites and resources out there that can give you a lot of examples of social stories and visual supports. For one, the Autism Society of North Carolina, that's us. We've got a growing web page dedicated to this topic of COVID-19. And we've offered a number of social stories and visual supports that are aimed at helping families and individuals with autism in navigating these difficult situations that they're encountering. The Indiana Resource Center for Autism, if you Google that, you'll see an array of wonderful COVID-19 resources. There's an Affirm module dedicated to COVID-19. The O'Callaghan Gallery of Interventions, which I previously referenced, and the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities. These are some of the many great sites that are out there that are offering a lot of resources, a library of resources for families and for individuals with autism and professionals right now. So I encourage you to check these out if you're looking for more examples of social stories or visual supports that you could then take and individually tailor for your own child with autism. And in this same vein of making a plan and clarifying what the plan is for your child with autism as it pertains to getting their work done, in this same vein of clarifying roles and expectations in more concrete, clear terms, the other key thing we have to make sure we're trying to do for our children with autism right now when they're encountering what can be an overwhelming amount of work is to break the hard stuff up. And there's a lot of different ways to do this, but as we break the hard stuff up for our students with autism or for our children with autism, it involves answering three key questions from the perspective of the individual with autism. Clarifying for the child with autism, how much do I have to do? How long will this work last? And when do I get to have the things I love again, whatever those things are, whether that's computer time, screen time, outside time, jumping on the couch time, my favorite snack, whatever it is, concretely clarifying in a way that the individual with autism can understand the answer to these three questions can take you, it can't solve all your problems, but it can take you far when we're trying to support folks with autism in engaging in more challenging or less preferred academic activities. So there are ways to do this, and some of the ways are ones I've already showed you. For example, you can use a visual schedule to clarify how much and how long and when is it over. The example where I showed you the sticky notes, where the student with autism pulls off the reading sticky notes and the math sticky notes, and he can see when his breaks are coming. That's an example of breaking the hard stuff up and clarifying concretely how much and how long and when is it finished. Here's another way that this could happen. This is but one example where a parent or caregiver takes the worksheet that's been assigned and breaks it down into more manageable chunks for their child with autism, clarifying concretely where the breaks are going to happen as well. So this is just but one example of ways to do this. Of course, we want to keep in mind too that when you're breaking up academic activities, think about how often your child is going to need breaks for movement or to access preferred activities. Of course, for some students with autism, they're going to need to access breaks every 5 minutes, maybe even more frequently than that. For other students with autism, those breaks can be less frequent, maybe every 30 minutes, maybe once an hour. It just depends on you know your child best, you know what they need. But the thing to keep in mind is to just proactively plan for those breaks and put those breaks into their schedule up front so that we're able to concretely clarify when those breaks are coming, when we're able to concretely clarify where's the light at the end of the tunnel on this work, when am I going to get to step away from this online work and take a break. That's what we want to think about. And then finding those activities that are actually meaningful and motivating and preferred and that produce a sense of calm and happiness, whatever those are for your child with autism, thinking about ways to make sure you're adding those into their day at a rate that meets those needs. Of course, we can use visual timers to break the hard stuff up and to clarify in more concrete and visual terms how much and how long and when is this finished. And so there's a lot of great apps and tools that are out there, and they don't have to be anything fancy necessarily. Of course, for some, it's a simple timer. For others, there may need to be, a more concrete visual representation of the passage of time. And you can see here, there's a lot of different apps that are available, freely available and downloadable to your phone that can support the student with autism in understanding how long am I going to have to complete this activity? How long do I need to read for? How many math problems do I need to do? How long do I have to do this for? There's a lot of ways to convey that. And it's important to note too that visual timers such as these are not only helpful when we're supporting our students with autism and understanding how long they're going to have to persist through something that they don't want to do, but it can also help to clarify for the student with autism how long their preferred break is going to last before it's going to be over. So how long is my video game break going to be? And concretely clarifying that in concrete visual terms can be really important. Or how long do I get to jump on the trampoline outside before I'm going to need to come back in and finish up my work for the day? So concretely, meaningfully clarifying this for children with autism is important. Again, you as parents and caregivers are really in an unprecedented role, and in many cases, what was already maybe very challenging has become even more challenging as you're now tasked with receiving academic activities and assignments from teachers, and you're having to filter out what your child can handle and what they can't, and you're having to make it meaningful and manageable for your child. And so in many cases, that means you're becoming the interpreter. Maybe you've been given an assignment, your child has been given an assignment, but you're having to concretely break that down in a way that's more understandable for your child. Of course, teachers give rubrics and criteria for what they expect, but sometimes for our students with autism, we're going to have to go even further to clarify the criteria for complete, to help our children with autism to see the details and to help them also see the big picture. And so if your child has been presented with a writing activity, for example, it may be important for you to concretely clarify how many sentences they need to write. Just to clarify, what's the light at the end of the tunnel? What amount of sentences might align with the teacher's expectations? And it might be important for you to make that clear for your child. How many facts do they need to provide? How many details do they need to offer? How long should they study before they take the online quiz? And so sometimes this can feel a little bit arbitrary, but at least giving some type of criteria for your child with autism so they understand what's expected and what the teacher might be looking for can be very helpful to them. It can also help them to persist through an activity where the criteria would otherwise not be clear, and it might set them up for failure if we don't do this in some cases. Show me an example of what finished looks like. So if they're supposed to present a little collage and build a little collage or slideshow, show me an example of what this should look like when it's done. Or if it's around mathematical problem solving, show my work. What does this look like and mean from the perspective of the student with autism? In some cases, this is going to mean we're going to need to visually structure this up. Maybe we present examples of what showing your work looks like, a couple of math problems solved where you show line by line what it means to show your work. In some cases, we can use visual maps or graphic organizers. And many of these are easily available, and some of them are freely downloadable online. And so just to give you a couple quick examples of these, and again, I am an educator by training, and I'm the parent of 3 boys, but I know that I'm talking to folks who are typically parents who maybe do not have an educational background. And so as I talk to you, I am not suggesting that you become a teacher and devise and develop elaborate fancy systems to support your child's academic learning. Just offering a few quick examples of things that you might be able to print out or to develop that could help your child, for example, to structure up their writing in a way that aligns with the teacher's expectations. And so this is one example of a graphic organizer that I was able to pull from the internet. There are 3 facts, and then from these 3 facts or details, what conclusion can the student with autism draw? Here's another quick example. This is sort of a web organizer, main idea and supporting details around it. And so again, if you don't have a printer, for example, you could visually draw and map out some ways to structure up your child's writing or thought process in ways that might support them in the academic assignment. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or elaborate. I just want to emphasize that again. These are just some basic quick ways that might clarify for your child with autism what the expectations are and the thought process that may need to be addressed as they're working on writing activities or science activities or social studies or whatever the comprehension activity is. So again, I've been talking about breaking the hard stuff up into manageable, meaningful chunks, clarifying concretely how much and how long and when is it finished. And just a little bit more on this topic that I want to say, again, you are parents and caregivers, and many of you are not educators by training, and nor should you be expected to be so. So it's just important to note too that in some cases we're hearing from many parents who are receiving academic activities and assignments, and they're working to simplify those. They're simplifying the vocabulary or the concepts related to the activity, or they're simplifying or individualizing the text to support comprehension. So maybe instead of working on a particular grade level text that's been assigned, a parent is deciding that that is not accessible to that child. And so they're using a different text to support completing the activity. Or maybe some parents and caregivers are rewording questions or answer choices into simpler language. Or of course, just reducing the complexity of the written work that's being assigned. And so if this is what you need to do to keep your child feeling successful, that is okay. Just know that these are modifications to the content that you're making. And so the reason I'm saying this to you is you need to make it, meaningful and manageable for your child. Do what's going to work for you and for your child. And just know that as you're engaged in kind of having to restructure or in some cases even modify the assignments that are being sent home to you, I encourage you strongly to engage in proactive and positive communication with the educator, the teachers who are involved in your students' learning. So for some basic tips and guidelines that our wonderful autism resource specialists here at the Autism Society have provided, for one, confirm and establish a method and frequency of communication with the teachers. So what I mean there is just decide how often, kind of come to agreement with you and the teacher on how often are you going to communicate with one another and what methods of communication are going to be most effective. And of course, we would think that weekly is appropriate in many cases, and very infrequent communication is probably not going to be very effective for either side. And so just reaching out to the teacher in a positive and proactive manner to clarify what's the best way to communicate and how often can we communicate. And of course, whenever possible, you want to support and structure your child's communication with their teacher. So we're working with a lot of students with autism in trying to support them in self-advocating during these very challenging times. And so we encourage you to think about how could you structure up those opportunities for your child to send the email to the teacher to ask for clarification or to get their needs met or to seek out more information on how to complete an activity. So whenever possible, think about using this time as a way to foster that greater level of independence for your student with autism and that self-advocacy. And I know that that's supremely challenging in these situations. But whenever possible, just think about whether that's something that you might be able to tap into during this time. When you're communicating with the teacher, let them know how much of the work is requiring reteaching or remediation, or how much of it you're having to directly assist your child in. And just, again, positively and clearly and objectively communicating that to the teacher so that they understand how this is looking at home right now. In some cases, you're going to, it's helpful to use emailed photos or video if you can, or scanning hard copies to show the teacher what your child is working on, even if it differs from what the teacher has provided. And then, of course, clarifying for the teacher whether those work products that the child is submitting or that you're submitting meet the requirements that the teacher is issuing. And just again, so I'm going back to this idea of positively and proactively communicating in this very challenging time. Another important thing to clarify is to just ask teachers, what do they consider to be a reasonable amount of time to be completing assignments? I can remember early on in the online phase, even for my middle school child, he was spending 5 and 6 hours a day trying to complete his work. And it was a very difficult time for him and for in our house, of course. And I finally reached out to the teachers to get clarity on how long should this be taking? What's a reasonable amount? And when they responded back, that really clarified for me and took some of the pressure off. And it showed us both that we needed to kind of restructure his day and recalibrate what was expected of him to make it a much more successful and manageable day for him. And of course, if your child is not regularly completing the tasks, despite the work that you're putting in and the work you're putting in to support your child, just reach out to the team. The point that, long story short, proactively and positively communicate with the educational team that's involved with your child. Establish a method of communication and find out what information they need most that can clarify how it's looking for your child at home. And then again, remember that, they're there to help give you the strategies and the content that you need to support your child. And I would just say as well, of course, trying to remember that many educators are also under tremendous stress from a variety of different sources. And so I myself, one time recently, started to send a pretty snippy little email to my son's science teacher. And I kind of checked myself. I read the email draft several times and I realized, this is probably not the best way to go if I'm trying to, establish and sustain positive communication on behalf of my child. And so I changed the way I'd worded the email because I tried to put myself in that science teacher's shoes and remember that they too are probably going through a lot of difficult things that maybe I don't know about. So I encourage you to consider these strategies as well as you're working with the educational team. And then finally, celebrate the little successes. This is a great quote that a wonderful parent of a child with autism provided to me recently. And she said that, no matter what happens, we have breakfast at 9, we start school around 10 and have lunch between 12:30 and 1, and we have scheduled recess and walks in the neighborhood twice a day. And then that way we all get the needed breaks. If she can get those things done, then she considers the day a success, even if everything else falls apart. So for you, define what your own successes are, whether those are small or great for your child with autism. If they get one of the assignments done that day, that's a success to celebrate. If they complete 2 math problems for some, that's a success. So you have to define what success means for you and then celebrate that. And again, remember that, put first things first and do what matters most for you and for your child with autism and for your family in these challenging times. And I would say this, of course, that we strongly encourage you to call on our autism resource specialists. These are all parents of children and adults with autism themselves who are here to support you during this challenging time. And so we encourage you to reach out to them with specific questions. If you go to our website, you can find help there and talking with a specialist who's positioned within your region across the state. They are the most wonderful resource because they know firsthand what it's like to be parents of a child with autism. I would also say this, that our clinical department at the Autism Society is offering a new service model during these challenging times, and we're calling it our Rapid Response Clinical Consultation Service. It's provided across the state in every county of North Carolina right now. And the reason we're able to do that in every county in North Carolina is because we're offering this service through a telehealth model. And so telehealth, as many of you probably know, it involves under optimal circumstances, it means live two-way video conferencing between the family or parent and caregivers and the consultant. And this service can be funded through a variety of different sources. It can be funded by the Innovations Waiver under specialized consultative services. It can be funded through Medicaid for both children and for adults with Medicaid. And it can also be funded through various private health insurance plans. In order for us to provide the service, the child or adolescent or adult must also have an established diagnosis of autism. And some of the areas we can address in this consultative model through telehealth are organizing, providing structure and helping you to organize the day, organizing and structuring activities across the day, whether that's academic activities or otherwise. quick tips and strategies to address specific skill areas, whether those are in the areas of social communication or activities of daily living or play skills or leisure skills, and basic behavioral intervention strategies. So there's a lot of different areas that we can address within this service. I just want to say as a disclaimer, though, that this short-term service is not intended to address extreme forms of problem behavior or mental health crisis. And the reason for this is because it's being provided through a telehealth model. And so in order to provide, to be safe and ethical, we need to, this service is not conducive. This short-term consultative service is not conducive to addressing severe forms of problem behavior or mental health crisis. So I would strongly encourage you, if you are experiencing or your child is experiencing behavioral or mental health crisis, please reach out to us. And so in terms of reaching out to us for any need, but in addition to our rapid response clinical consultation service, this is the contact information for our clinical department. It's clinical@autismsociety-nc.org. And our main line for the clinical department is 919-390-7242. And so I hope today's webinar has been helpful. Again, I realize these are just quick tips and strategies to support you in structuring your child's academic day and thinking about some of the main considerations. First and foremost, putting your family's needs first, whatever needs those are, and establishing what your priorities are that will keep your family safe and calm, or relatively calm and relatively happy during these challenging times. And then breaking up the hard parts of the day or that child's academic day and restructuring activities in academics to make it more manageable and meaningful for the child with autism, and concretely clarifying how much and how long and when is it finished. And then celebrating the successes in whatever form those come. And so just a couple other quick things I wanted to point out to you. Of course, go to our website. We have a coronavirus disease webpage that's growing all of the time with resources on a variety of different topics and issues. We've got a number of recorded webinars in addition to this one on a variety of topics, so I encourage you to check those out. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, we've got a range of social narratives that are intended to support you during these challenging times and to support the individual with autism during these challenging times. And we are not the only ones pushing out great resources and tools, and so this is just but one of those many other great resources that are out there. University of North Carolina Chapel Hill's Toolkit, supporting individuals with autism during uncertain times. It's their Affirm module that's specific to COVID-19. We encourage you to check that resource out. And then finally, we encourage you to go to most empirically validated and reputable sources for information on coronavirus and COVID-19 in general. And then the Centers for Disease Control, of course, the CDC, as well as the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. So thank you again for your time today. I encourage you to reach back out to me if you have any specific questions about this webinar. My name is Louise Southern. My email address is at the beginning of this presentation, and it's lsouthern@autismsociety-nc.org. And again, just reach out to the Autism Society in general, and we're here to help you in whatever way we can. Thank you so much.